What would you do if you thought your husband didn't care enough to even get jealous until a court order landed on your doorstep? How did I go from making jokes about him in front of everyone to seeing my whole life unravel in a single morning? I never thought his revenge would be so calm, cold, and final. I should have seen it coming. The way Graeme's jaw tightened when I launched into my favorite story about how he never gets jealous. But honestly, everyone was laughing so hard at Romano's that night, I felt like the star of the show. So there I was, I said, gesturing dramatically with my wine glass, texting this gorgeous guy from work right in front of Graeme. And you know what my husband does? I paused for effect, looking around the table at our friends and family. Absolutely nothing. He just keeps watching his stupid football game like I'm invisible. The table erupted in laughter. My mother Elaine nearly choked on her breadstick. "Oh, Delyth, you're terrible," she gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm serious, though," I continued, warming to my audience. "I could probably bring another man home for dinner, and Graeme would just ask if he wants a beer. Zero backbone, zero passion. Sometimes I wonder if he'd even notice if I disappeared entirely." That's when I noticed Graeme's brother Mike wasn't laughing. He was staring at me with this uncomfortable expression, like I'd just said something deeply wrong. But before I could think about it, my mother-in-law Marge spoke up. "Delyth, that's quite enough." Her voice was ice cold. "Oh, come on, Marge," I waved her off. "It's just harmless teasing. Graeme knows I'm kidding around." "Don't you, honey?" I looked over at my husband, expecting his usual sheepish smile and shoulder shrug. Instead, Graeme was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His brown eyes, usually so warm and patient, were completely flat, empty. "Sure, Delyth," he said quietly. "Very funny." But something in his tone made my stomach flutter with unease. Still, everyone else was still chuckling, and I lived for this kind of attention. Being the funny one, the entertaining one, the one everyone wanted to hear more from. "The best part," I pushed on, "is that Evan, that's my co-worker, he actually asked me if Graeme was even straight. Can you imagine? He said most men would have punched him by now just for looking at their wife the wrong way." The laughter died down a bit. Mike was definitely not amused now, and Marge looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Even my father Rob was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, but I was on a roll. I told Evan that Graeme's just not the jealous type. He's too, I don't know, passive? Like, sweetie, no offense, but you've never fought for anything in your entire life. That's when Graeme stood up, not dramatically, not angrily. He just quietly pushed back his chair and reached for his wallet. "Where are you going?" I asked, suddenly feeling like I'd missed something important. "Home," he said simply, pulling out a 20 and placing it on the table. "Thanks for dinner, everyone. Delyth, I'll see you later." And then he walked away, just like that. No argument, no scene, nothing. He nodded politely to the other diners as he passed their tables, pushed open the restaurant door, and disappeared into the parking lot. The silence at our table was deafening. "Well," I said with a forced laugh, "I guess I hit a nerve. He'll get over it. He always does." But Marge was already gathering her purse. "I think I'll head home too," she said stiffly. "Rob, Elaine, it was lovely seeing you." She didn't even look at me as she left. Mike stood up next. "Delyth, can I give you some advice?" "Sure," I said, though his serious tone was making me nervous. Just stop whatever game you think you're playing. Graeme's not weak, he's patient. There's a difference, and patience has limits." Then he was gone too, leaving me sitting there with my parents and our friends, all of whom were suddenly very interested in their dessert menus. "Don't listen to them," my mother said, reaching over to pat my hand. "Men just don't understand when women need to vent a little. Graeme will be fine by tomorrow." But as I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the image of Graeme's face, that cold, empty look in his eyes. I'd seen him disappointed before, hurt before, frustrated before, but I'd never seen him look at me like I was a stranger. Our house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Graeme's truck was there, but every light was off. I found him in our bedroom, already in his pajamas, reading a book. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "You okay? You left pretty suddenly." He looked up at me, and for just a second I saw a flash of something, pain, maybe, in his expression. But then it was gone, replaced by that same flat emptiness from the restaurant. "I'm fine, Delyth. Just tired. Look, if I said something that bothered you, you didn't say anything you haven't said before." He closed his book and set it on the nightstand. "I'm going to sleep now." He turned off his bedside lamp and rolled over, facing away from me. The conversation was clearly over. As I got ready for bed, I tried to convince myself that everything was normal. Graeme was just being overly sensitive. He'd always been too serious, too quiet. That's why I needed someone like Evan in my life, someone who appreciated my humor, my personality, my need for excitement. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to Graeme's steady breathing, I couldn't escape the feeling that something fundamental had shifted tonight. Something I might not be able to shift back. The next morning, Graeme was gone before I woke up. He'd left coffee in the pot for me, like always, but no note, no "have a good day" or "see you tonight." Just coffee and silence. At work, I found myself gravitating toward Evan's office more than usual. He was everything Graeme wasn't: charming, flirtatious, full of energy. When he smiled at me, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. "You look stressed," he said when I appeared in his doorway around 10 a.m. "Trouble in paradise?" "Something like that," I sighed, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Graeme got all weird last night when I was telling some stories about him at dinner." Evan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of stories?" "Just funny stuff about how he never gets jealous, how he's so passive about everything. Everyone was cracking up, but apparently his feelings got hurt." Evan leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You know, Delyth, maybe it's time you stopped worrying so much about his feelings and started thinking about what you need." The way he said it sent a little thrill through me. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're a vibrant, intelligent, beautiful woman who deserves to be appreciated. If your husband can't see that, maybe someone else should." My phone buzzed with a text from Graeme. "Will you be home for dinner tonight? Making Tessa's favorite." I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. "You're right," I told Evan. "I do deserve to be appreciated." Over the next few weeks, things at home grew increasingly tense. Graeme wasn't fighting with me exactly, but he wasn't really talking to me either. He'd come home from his job at the construction company, help our 8-year-old daughter Tessa with her homework, make dinner, and then disappear into his home office or the garage. Meanwhile, my friendship with Evan was deepening. We started taking lunch breaks together, staying late to finish projects, texting constantly. I told myself it was harmless, just friendship, just someone who actually listened to me and made me feel special. But I knew it was more than that. And part of me didn't care. "You seem different lately," my mother observed during one of our weekly phone calls. "Happier, more like your old self." "I've just been having more fun at work," I said vaguely. "There's this new project I'm working on with a colleague. It's energizing." "Good for you, honey. You were getting so dull staying home with Graeme all the time. A woman needs intellectual stimulation." If only she knew what kind of stimulation I was really getting. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. I'd stayed late with Evan again, and we'd ended up kissing in his car in the parking lot. It was electric, passionate, everything my marriage hadn't been in years. When I finally got home at nearly 9 p.m., I found Graeme sitting at the kitchen table with Tessa, helping her with a science project. "Mummy," Tessa jumped up and hugged me. "Daddy said you had to work late again. We saved you some spaghetti." "That's sweet, baby," I said, not quite meeting Graeme's eyes. "I'm not really hungry, though." "Long day." Graeme's voice was carefully neutral. "This is the 4th night this week you've been late." It's a busy time at the office, I said defensively. Some of us have demanding jobs. It was a low blow. Graeme's construction work was seasonal, and he'd been doing more of the childcare lately while I worked late. But instead of rising to the bait, he just nodded. "Tessa, go get ready for your bath," he said quietly. Once she was upstairs, Graeme turned to me. "Delyth, is there something you want to tell me?" My heart hammered in my chest. Did he know? Had someone seen Evan and me together? Like what? Like why you've been so distant lately, why you don't answer my texts, why you look at me like I'm bothering you just by existing. The hurt in his voice almost broke through my defenses. Almost. "You're being paranoid," I said instead. "I'm just stressed with work. Not everything is about you, Graeme." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw that empty look in his eyes again. The one from the restaurant. "You're right," he said finally. "Not everything is about me." That weekend, Graeme's mother, Marge, called to invite us to Sunday dinner. It was a family tradition we'd maintained for years, but lately I'd been finding excuses to skip. "Tell her I have a headache," I told Graeme when he handed me the phone. "Tell her yourself," he replied, walking away. I could hear Marge's disappointed sigh through the phone. "Delyth, dear, is everything all right? You've missed the last 3 dinners." "Everything's fine, Marge. I've just been really busy with work." "I see." There was a pause. "You know, Graeme seems different lately, quieter than usual. Are you two having problems?" The concern in her voice irritated me. Of course she'd take her precious son's side. "We're fine," I said curtly. "Graeme's just being overly sensitive about some things." "Overly sensitive about what things?" I almost told her. Almost said that her son was being ridiculous, that he couldn't handle a little harmless flirtation, that he was suffocating me with his neediness and suspicion. Instead, I said, "Nothing important. I really do have a headache, Marge. Maybe next week." But there wouldn't be a next week. At least, not the way I expected. By April, I'd convinced myself that I was the victim in my own marriage. Graeme's quiet disappointment felt like judgment. His careful questions felt like interrogation. His patient presence felt like surveillance. So I decided to take control of the narrative. "We should have people over," I announced one Saturday morning. "It's been too long since we entertained." Graeme looked up from where he was making Tessa pancakes. "If you want to have people over, that's fine with me." "Great. I'll invite my parents, your mom and Mike, maybe the Hendersons from down the street. Make it a real party." Something flickered across Graeme's face. Resignation, maybe, but he just nodded. "Whatever makes you happy, Delyth." I spent the week planning what I privately thought of as my vindication party. I'd show everyone what I had to deal with. How Graeme's moody silences were making our home uncomfortable. How his suspicion and jealousy were driving me to seek friendship elsewhere. The party was set for the following Saturday. I made all of Graeme's favorite foods, bought his favorite beer, even put on the dress he'd complimented me in last Christmas. I was going to be the perfect hostess, and everyone would see that I was trying my best with a difficult husband. But things didn't go according to plan. It started when Marge arrived and barely spoke to me. She hugged Tessa warmly, kissed Graeme's cheek, and gave me a polite nod before settling in the living room with a glass of wine and a distinctly chilly demeanor. Then Mike showed up looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. When I tried to make conversation about his new job, he answered in monosyllables and quickly moved away to talk to his brother. Even my own parents seemed off. My father Rob kept checking his watch, and my mother Elaine, usually my biggest supporter, seemed distracted and uncomfortable. But I was determined to salvage the evening. After dinner, when everyone was relaxed with drinks, I launched into what I thought would be a light-hearted story about my work situation. "So, you guys remember Evan from my office, right? The one I mentioned before," I began, settling into the couch with my wine. "Well, he's been such a lifesaver lately with all these late projects. Graeme thinks I'm working too much, but honestly, it's nice to be around someone who appreciates my contributions." I was aiming for casual and funny, but the room felt strangely tense. Anyway, I continued, Evan was telling me the other day that he can't believe how understanding Graeme is about me spending so much time at the office. He said most husbands would be suspicious by now. That's when I noticed Graeme had his phone out, seemingly scrolling through something. But the screen was black. Was he recording? The thing is, I pushed on, my voice getting a little louder, Graeme's just not the suspicious type. He's too trusting for his own good. Sometimes I think he wouldn't notice if I was having an affair right under his nose. The silence that followed was deafening. Tessa, who'd been colouring at the coffee table, looked up with confusion. "Mommy, what's an affair?" Before I could answer, Marge stood up abruptly. "I think it's time for me to go home." "Marge, wait," I said, but she was already heading for the door. Mike followed immediately. "Thanks for dinner," he said to Graeme, completely ignoring me. "I'll call you tomorrow." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "We should probably head out too," my father said uncomfortably. "Early morning tomorrow." Within 15 minutes, everyone was gone except for our immediate family. Tessa had been sent upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving Graeme and me alone in the wreckage of my failed party. "Well, that was awkward," I said, trying to laugh it off. "I guess everyone's in a weird mood tonight." Graeme was still sitting on the couch, his phone now openly in his hands. He was definitely recording. "Are you seriously recording me right now?" I demanded. "I'm documenting things," he said calmly, "for my own records." "That's insane, Graeme, and probably illegal." "It's not illegal to record conversations in your own home in Colorado," he replied, his voice still eerily calm. "I looked it up." The casual way he said it sent a chill down my spine. When had Graeme ever looked up legal information about anything? "Why would you need to record me?" He finally looked at me directly, and that empty expression was back. "Because apparently I'm too trusting for my own good, too understanding, too stupid to notice what's happening right under my nose." My mouth went dry. "Graeme, I was just making conversation. You know I didn't mean anything by it." "Didn't you?" He stood up, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Because it sounded like you meant every word." He headed toward the stairs, then paused. "I'll be sleeping in the guest room from now on. I think we both need some space to figure out what we really want." That night, I lay alone in our king-size bed, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I was supposed to be the sympathetic one, the wife dealing with an unreasonable husband. Instead, I felt like I was losing control of my own story. Around midnight, I crept down the hall and tried the guest room door. It was locked. Graeme had never locked a door against me in our entire marriage. Standing there in the dark hallway, I finally understood that something irreversible was happening. The patient, understanding man I'd married was disappearing, being replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who recorded conversations and locked doors and looked at me like I was a stranger. Someone who might actually be done with me. The locked door became a symbol of everything that was crumbling in my life. Every morning I'd hear Graeme moving around in the guest room, getting ready for work, but he'd be gone before I emerged. Every evening he'd come home, help Tessa with homework, make dinner, and disappear behind that locked door again. We were living like polite strangers sharing a house. 2 weeks after the disastrous party, I was grabbing lunch with my friend Jennifer from the gym when she dropped a bombshell. "So, I saw Graeme at Starbucks yesterday," she said casually, picking at her salad. "Okay?" I waited for more. "He was with some guy in a suit. They had a bunch of papers spread out on the table, looked pretty serious. The suit guy had one of those legal briefcases, you know?" My blood turned to ice. "What kind of papers?" "I don't know. I didn't want to be obvious about looking. But Delyth, it looked like a business meeting. A formal one." That evening, I waited until Graeme was in the shower to search his nightstand. I found a folder labeled household documents that definitely hadn't been there before. Inside were copies of our bank statements, mortgage papers, Tessa's school records, And my work schedule from the past 3 months. My work schedule, with all those late nights highlighted in yellow. At the bottom of the folder was a business card. Robert Chen, family law attorney. I was still staring at the card when I heard the shower turn off. I quickly shoved everything back into the folder and crept back to the master bedroom, my heart pounding. Graeme was seeing a divorce lawyer. My husband, who I'd always assumed would never have the backbone to leave me, was quietly preparing to end our marriage. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to my parents' house. "Mom, I think Graeme's going to divorce me," I blurted out as soon as she opened the door. Elaine's face went through several expressions: surprise, concern, and something else I couldn't identify. "Come in, honey, let's talk." We sat in her pristine living room with coffee and store-bought cookies while I poured out my fears. I told her about the locked guest room, the lawyer's business card, Graeme's strange behavior. What I didn't tell her was about Evan, about the lunches and the late nights and the kiss in the parking lot, about the way my heart raced when he texted me, or how I'd started wearing perfume to work again. "I don't understand why he's being so dramatic," I finished. "So I've been working late and making a few jokes about our marriage. That's normal stuff. Everyone complains about their spouse sometimes." My mother was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Delyth," she said finally, "is there something you're not telling me? About this coworker you've been spending so much time with?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, honey, you've mentioned this Evan person quite a bit lately, and the way you light up when you talk about him." She trailed off, watching my face carefully. "We're just friends, Mom. Good friends. Is that a crime?" "No, but..." She sighed. "Delyth, I've been married to your father for 32 years. I know what it looks like when someone is getting their emotional needs met outside their marriage." I felt exposed, defensive. "So what if I am? Graeme certainly isn't meeting them. He barely talks to me anymore." "Maybe he's not talking because he's hurt." "Hurt by what? I haven't done anything wrong." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true, but I wasn't ready to admit that, not even to myself. That afternoon, I picked Tessa up from school as usual. She was quieter than normal, staring out the window instead of chattering about her day. "Everything okay, baby?" I asked. "Mummy, are you and Daddy getting divorced?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What? No, why would you ask that?" "Madison's parents got divorced last year, and she said they stopped sleeping in the same room first, and they stopped talking to each other, and they were always sad." I pulled into our driveway and turned to look at my daughter. Her 8-year-old face was creased with worry, and I realized she'd been carrying this fear around for weeks. "Daddy and I are just going through a rough patch," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "All married people do that sometimes. It doesn't mean we're getting divorced." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. That evening, Graeme came home with groceries and started making Tessa's favorite dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, noting how tired he looked, how his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "Graeme," I said softly, "can we talk?" He looked up from the stove. "About what?" "About us. About what's happening to our marriage." For a moment, I thought he might actually open up. His expression softened slightly, and I saw a flicker of the man I'd married. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went neutral again. "I need to take this," he said, stepping into his home office and closing the door. I could hear his voice through the door, low and serious, but I couldn't make out the words. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and when he emerged, he looked more determined than I'd seen him in months. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work," he said, but I knew he was lying. That night, as I lay alone in our bed, listening to the sounds of Graeme settling into the guest room, I finally admitted to myself that my marriage was ending. The man who'd once loved me enough to overlook my flaws, to laugh at my jokes, to trust me completely, was systematically preparing to remove me from his life. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I could blame him. The process server found me in the break room at work on a Tuesday morning in May. I was heating up leftover pizza and scrolling through text messages from Evan when a professional-looking woman in a navy suit appeared in the doorway. "Delyth Mora?" "Yes?" "You've been served." She handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away. My hand shook as I opened it. "Petition for legal separation" was printed in bold letters across the top of the first page. Below that, Graeme's name as petitioner, mine as respondent. I sank into a plastic chair, scanning the legal language. Graeme was requesting temporary custody arrangements for Tessa, division of marital assets, and formal separation of finances. There was a hearing date scheduled for 3 weeks away. "Delyth, you okay?" Evan appeared in the break room doorway, concern creasing his handsome features. I held up the papers wordlessly. "Oh, shit," he said, closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry. I know this is hard, but maybe it's for the best. You haven't been happy for a long time." His words stung, even though they were probably true. I didn't think he'd actually go through with it." Evan sat down across from me, reaching for my hands. "Hey, look at me. You're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to be free." That's when I noticed my coworker Janet standing outside the break room's glass wall, staring at us with wide eyes. Evan was holding my hands across the table, leaning in close, speaking in intimate whispers. To anyone watching, we looked exactly like what we were, a woman and her lover discussing her impending divorce. By the end of the day, everyone in the office knew about my separation papers, and probably about Evan too. I drove home in a daze, the legal document sitting on my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode. How was I going to explain this to Tessa? To my parents? To anyone who asked? Graeme's truck was already in the driveway when I arrived. I found him in the kitchen, calmly preparing what looked like a very organized dinner. Tessa was at the table, working on homework. "We need to talk," I said, holding up the envelope. "After dinner," he replied without looking up. "Tessa, how was school today?" The normalcy of it was surreal. Here was my husband, who had just formally initiated the end of our marriage, asking our daughter about her spelling test like it was any other Tuesday. During dinner, I kept waiting for some acknowledgement of what had happened, some sign that Graeme was feeling the weight of this decision. But he seemed calmer than he had in months, asking Tessa about her friends, helping her with math problems, even making her laugh with a silly joke about her teacher's pet hamster. It wasn't until Tessa was upstairs getting ready for bed that he finally turned to me. "Did you get the papers?" "Of course I got the papers. Everyone at work saw me get served, Graeme. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" "I'm sorry about that. I asked them to deliver it to the house, but you're never here." The casual way he said it, like he was commenting on the weather, made my anger flare. "So this is really happening? You're really going to break up our family over some imaginary problem?" Graeme looked at me with that same empty expression I'd grown to hate. "There's nothing imaginary about it, Delyth. You've been having an affair." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. "That's ridiculous," I said, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. "Is it?" He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "Because I have 6 weeks' worth of text messages between you and Evan Riles. I have photos of you two having lunch together, holding hands in his car, kissing in the parking lot of Romano's, the same restaurant where you publicly humiliated me, by the way." My blood turned to ice. "You've been spying on me." "I've been documenting the destruction of my marriage," he corrected, "for legal purposes." He showed me his phone screen. There was a photo of Evan and me kissing in his car, taken from across the parking lot but clear enough to be unmistakable. "You hired a private investigator." "I didn't have to. You weren't exactly discreet." He put the phone away. "The question now is whether we can handle this through mediation or if you're going to force us into court." I stared at the stranger wearing my husband's face. When had quiet, passive Graeme become so calculating, so prepared. "I want to try counseling," I said desperately. "We can work through this." "No, we can't." His voice was final. "I'm done, Delyth. I'm done being disrespected, humiliated, and cheated on. I'm done pretending this marriage is salvageable." That weekend, I drove to my parents' house with Tessa, hoping for support and sympathy. Instead, I found my father waiting in the living room with a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said. "Tessa, why don't you go play in the backyard for a bit?" Once she was outside, both my parents sat down across from me on the couch. "Delyth," my father began, "Graeme called us yesterday." My stomach dropped. "What did he tell you?" "Everything," my mother said quietly. "About the affair, about the things you've been saying about him, about how you've been treating him." "I can't believe you're taking his side." "We're not taking sides," my father said firmly. "But honey, we're disappointed. Very disappointed." "Disappointed in what? In me trying to find some happiness? In me refusing to settle for a marriage with no passion, no excitement?" "Disappointed in you having an affair," my mother said bluntly. "Disappointed in you lying to us, to Tessa, to yourself. Disappointed in you destroying your family for some office romance." The words hit harder than I expected. My mother, who had always been my biggest cheerleader, was looking at me like I was a stranger. "You don't understand," I said, tears starting to fall. "Graeme doesn't appreciate me. He takes me for granted. He's boring and passive and—" "He's a good man," my father interrupted. "He's a good father, a good provider, and he's been a good husband to you for 10 years. And you threw it away for what? Some excitement?" I couldn't answer that. Sitting in my parents' living room, watching my daughter play innocently in the backyard, I finally saw my choices clearly. And I didn't like what I saw. But it was too late. The papers were filed, the lawyers were involved, and Graeme was done with me. 3 weeks later, I sat in a sterile conference room across from my husband and his attorney, officially ending the marriage I'd spent months destroying. The mediation conference room smelled like industrial carpet and disappointment. I sat across from Graeme, barely recognizing the man I'd been married to for 10 years. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and had a leather folder full of organized documents. His lawyer, Robert Chen, was equally prepared, with multiple binders and a laptop open in front of him. My own attorney, a harried-looking woman named Patricia Wells, who I'd hired at the last minute, shuffled through a thin folder of papers and kept glancing at her watch. "Before we begin," the mediator said, "I want to remind everyone that we're here to reach an amicable agreement that serves the best interests of all parties, particularly your daughter Tessa." I nodded, trying to look reasonable and cooperative. This was my chance to salvage something from the wreckage of my marriage, to show everyone that I wasn't the villain in this story. "Mr. Mura, would you like to begin with your custody proposal?" Graeme cleared his throat and opened his folder. "I'm requesting joint physical custody with a 50-50 schedule. I've prepared a detailed parenting plan that accounts for Tessa's school schedule, extracurricular activities, and social needs." He slid a document across the table. It was thorough, professional, and clearly the work of someone who had been planning this for months. "I've also documented my involvement in Tessa's daily care over the past year," he continued. "School pickup and drop-off schedules, medical appointments, parent-teacher conferences, homework supervision." My attorney leaned over to whisper in my ear. "This is very comprehensive. Do you have similar documentation?" I didn't. I'd been too busy with Evan to keep track of who did what with Tessa. "Mrs. Mura," the mediator said, "do you have any objections to the proposed custody arrangement?" I think I should have primary custody," I said, trying to sound confident. "Mothers are typically better equipped to handle the emotional needs of young children." Graeme's lawyer immediately responded, "Mr. Mura has been the primary caregiver for the past 6 months, while Mrs. Mura was occupied with other commitments." The way he said other commitments made it clear he was referring to my affair. That's not fair, I protested. I was working late to support our family. Were you? Graeme spoke for the first time, his voice calm but cold. Because according to your employer's records, you were only scheduled to work until 5 p.m. on most of those days. He produced another document. I've also prepared a timeline of your activities over the past 4 months, including photographs, text message records, and witness statements. My mouth went dry. You can't use private messages in court. These aren't private messages, his lawyer explained. These are communications that directly relate to the dissolution of the marriage and the welfare of the minor child. They spread out a series of photographs across the table. Me and Evan holding hands at lunch, kissing in his car, entering a hotel together on what was supposed to be a late work night. I felt the blood drain from my face. Where did you get these? Your behavior was quite public, Graeme said simply. Multiple people witnessed it. The mediator studied the photographs with a neutral expression. Mrs. Mora, do you dispute the authenticity of these images? No, but... I looked desperately at my attorney, who was frantically taking notes and looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mrs. Mora, the mediator continued, I also have a report from Tessa's school counselor indicating that she's been experiencing anxiety and behavioral issues related to tension in the home. She specifically mentioned that her mother has been sad and angry and that her parents don't talk to each other anymore. This was spiraling out of control. I was supposed to be the sympathetic party here, the woman whose husband was being unreasonable and vindictive. Instead, I was being presented as an unfaithful wife who had neglected her daughter. I love Tessa more than anything, I said, my voice breaking. I would never do anything to hurt her. But you did hurt her, Graeme said quietly. You hurt all of us. For the first time since this whole process began, I saw a flash of real emotion in his eyes. Not anger, not hatred, but deep, profound sadness. You made jokes about our marriage in front of our friends and family. You humiliated me in public, repeatedly. You had an affair and lied about it for months. You turned our home into a place where our daughter was afraid to speak because she could feel the tension. His voice remained steady, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. I tried to save our marriage, Delyth. I tried to be patient, to give you space, to hope that you'd remember what we used to mean to each other. But you didn't want to be saved. You wanted to be right. The room was completely silent except for the sound of the mediator's pen scratching across her notepad. So yes, Graeme continued, I documented everything. I hired a lawyer. I protected my interests and my daughter's interests, because someone had to. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that he was making me sound like a monster when I was just a woman who had made some mistakes. But looking at the evidence spread across the table, the photographs, the timeline, the school counselor's report, I realized that my version of events didn't matter anymore. The facts spoke for themselves. 3 hours later, we had reached an agreement. Joint custody, with Tessa spending equal time with both parents. I would keep the house but take on the full mortgage payment. Graeme would keep his retirement accounts and his truck. We would split Tessa's expenses and make decisions about her welfare jointly. It was fair, reasonable, and completely devastating. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Graeme stood up and looked at me directly for the first time all day. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I don't hate you. I'm not trying to punish you. I just can't be married to someone who doesn't respect me. He paused, his expression softening slightly. I hope someday you figure out what you really want, Delyth, and I hope it makes you happier than destroying our family did. Then he walked out of the conference room, his lawyer following behind, leaving me sitting there with the ruins of my marriage scattered across a conference table. 6 months later, I watched from my kitchen window as Graeme picked up Tessa for his week with her. She ran to his truck with her backpack and overnight bag, chattering excitedly about some school project they were going to work on together. He helped her into the passenger seat, ruffled her hair, and made her laugh about something. Then he glanced toward the house and saw me watching. For just a moment, our eyes met through the window. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He just looked at me with that same empty expression I'd grown to recognize, then got in his truck and drove away with our daughter. I was alone in the house we'd bought together, surrounded by the silence I'd created, finally understanding that some mistakes can't be undone. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. And some people, once they're done with you, are truly done. Graeme had gotten his revenge after all, not through anger or cruelty, but through something much more devastating: complete indifference. He'd simply removed me from his life with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, and moved on without looking back. As I stood there in my empty kitchen, I realized that this was what real consequences looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or passionate arguments, but the steady, methodical dissolution of everything I'd taken for granted. And the worst part was knowing that I had no one to blame but myself,